Hello people! I have come on today to do a story about the first Thanksgiving. The first Thanksgiving in America, which for us in the U.S. we are celebrating tomorrow. And I got a great book recently about what really happened at the first Thanksgiving, which was in 1621, the first American Thanksgiving. And I really like that this book really kind of talks about what really happened. So this is called 1621, A New Look at Thanksgiving. And it is Catherine O'Neill Grace and Margaret M. Bruchac. In case you want to check it out. All right, now. So I do kind of, this is a little bit older book, storybook for a little bit older kids probably, but I really like that it tells the truth. It tells the truth about what really happened. So the foreword I am going to skip. We will start with A Bountiful Harvest. By the English calendar, it is autumn 1621. For the Wampanoag, it is Keepanumuk, the time of the harvest. In a small settlement on the edge of the sea, more than 90 native men, members of the Wampanoag Nation, share food with 52 English people. The English are survivors of the 101 who arrived less than a year earlier aboard a ship called Mayflower. For more than 12,000 years, native people have fished these waters, hunted these woods, and cultivated these fields. The Wampanoag know this village site as Pawtuxet. The English have renamed it New Plymouth. When the English landed in the Wampanoag homeland, Pawtuxet was empty because the population of the village had been devastated by plague. During their first winter, more than half of the English died. Now in autumn, the survivors are celebrating their first successful harvest. Massasoit, a Wampanoag sachem, or leader, who has kept close watch on these strangers, has arrived with 90 of his warriors. For 3 days, this group, both English and Wampanoag, will eat together and engage in diplomacy. Over the centuries, the story of this event will be lost, recovered, told, and retold. Traditions and misunderstandings will turn the so-called First Thanksgiving into an American popular myth, not a true story. Generations of schoolchildren have imagined brave, peaceful settlers, the Pilgrims, inviting a few wild Indians over for dinner. In the myth, the Wampanoag side has been left out. The true story is a lot more complicated. History is never simple. The history of the English colonies in America is a history of European people imposing their culture, politics, and religion onto native people. It is also a litany of the voices of many natives, both past and present, who have persisted through plagues, war, and invasion. Read, listen, and think about this, our shared history. So people of the first light, isn't that a beautiful image? Totally lets you see where they were together. The word Wampanoag means people of the light, though the Wampanoag have come to be known as the people of the first light or people of the east. The Wampanoag Indian program at Plymouth Plantation is dedicated to preserving their history. Nana Pashamet, the former director of the program, wrote of his people, "We are the first people to see the beginning of the day. We traditionally refer to ourselves as the people, implying original, common people. We are the true people of this land, what is now called southern Massachusetts and eastern Rhode Island. We have lived with this land for thousands of generations, fishing in the waters, planting and harvesting crops, hunting the four-legged and winged beasts, and giving respect and thanks for each and every thing we have taken use of. We were originally taught to use many resources, remembering to use them with care, respect, and a mind toward preserving some for 7 generations of unborn, and not to waste anything. God, look at that beautiful image. And there's a little map of where they were. In the 17th century, Wampanoag territory extended from Grafton, Massachusetts, to the southeastern corner of Rhode Island and across Cape Cod, including the islands now called Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. All Wampanoag people knew the boundaries of this territory. They considered themselves careful caretakers of this land. It was owned by none, but held and used with respect by all. Wampanoag life centered on providing food and shelter for families and maintaining peaceful villages. Councils of elders, clan leaders, and chiefs, called sachems, led the people and worked to keep families, villages, and the Wampanoag nation strong. There are many historic writings about the native people of the Northeast. Most are written from the point of view of Europeans who were outsiders and invaders. Much of what was written in the time about native people is wrong or distorted, but there is still much to be learned from these writings, especially when they are combined with oral histories. The oral histories of the Wampanoag people, the spoken words that have been passed on from generation to generation for thousands of years, have continued into the present. Valuable lessons are always learned from the retelling of past events and traditional stories. Such retelling also helps keep a culture and community alive and connected. Just beautiful. The Wampanoag language. The Wampanoag language, correctly spelled, here you can look at this word here. Hopefully you can see it. Wampanoag is one of a family of related languages that springs from a time, thousands of years past, when all the people of this continent's eastern region spoke one original language. Wampanoag language combines sounds and relationships into long words. One Wampanoag word is often a whole sentence in English. Early European colonists who listened to spoken Wampanoag, with its many symbols, described it as sounding like a rippling brook. Some Wampanoag words are known to speakers of English for today. For example, the modern dish of corn and beans called succotash came from the Wampanoag word succotash. The language also reflects the philosophy that all people in the nation are connected. When Wampanoag people speak about relatives, for example, each kinship term uses certain syllables to specify the relationship of the relative to both the speaker and the listener. Many Wampanoag were quicker to learn English than the English were to speak Wampanoag. In the 17th century, a written form of the language was created. The first Bible printed in the new word was in Wampanoag. Missionary John Eliot's version of the King James Bible, translated in 1663 by 2 English-speaking natives. By the mid-1800s, however, English assimilation efforts led to the gradual decline of Wampanoag. Today, some of the documents the English used to convert the Wampanoag are helping the Wampanoag people to remember their original language. Oh, look at all the homes. Colonizing the New World. The Mayflower voyagers were not the first explorers in Wampanoag territory. English, Dutch, and French explorers, fishermen, and traders were here many years before Mayflower. It was not unusual for Europeans to kidnap native people as curiosities. In the early 1600s, English traders kidnapped at least 29 Wampanoag men who were held in Europe for years and who learned the language and observed the ways of the English. The early European visitors to North America brought trade, but they also brought sickness. The Wampanoag people had no resistance to these new diseases. From 1616 to 1618, a plague swept the coast from what is now Maine to Massachusetts, killing so many native people that in some places there were not enough healthy people to bury the dead. In Pawtuxet, a Wampanoag village on Plymouth Harbor, so many people died that the village was abandoned. And guns. The origins of the Plymouth colony were in a congregation of English Protestants called Separatists, who had broken away from the dominant Church of England. They lived in exile in Leiden, Holland. After a dozen years of economic hardship in Holland, this English congregation decided to seek a new home. They received funding from some English merchants to sail across the Atlantic to find a place to settle in the New World. After several lengthy delays, a total of 101 men, women, and children set sail from Plymouth, England on September 6, 1620. On board the ship, members of the Holland congregation were joined by other Englishmen. During the voyage, one baby was born and one passenger died. The ship reached land on November 11th after 66 days at sea. The region and harbor where Mayflower landed were called Cape Cod by English sailors and fishermen. The English colonists had not planned to arrive there at all. They had intended to land on the mouth of the Hudson River, where New York City now stands. But contrary winds kept them from rounding Cape Cod to travel southward. Because winter was approaching, they decided to find a nearby place to stay. For a month, the English explored the territory. They discovered and stole Wampanoag supplies, corn from storage pits, beads and ornaments from grave sites, and baskets and pots from the native homes called wettis. One colonist wrote, "Whilst some of us were digging up this, some others found another heap of corn, which they digged up also, so as we had in all about 10 bushels, which will serve us sufficiently for seed. And sure it was not God's good providence that we found this corn, for else we know not how we should have done, for we knew not how we should find or meet with any Indians, except it be to do us mischief." The colonists thought they had a right to help themselves to whatever they pleased. They believed God had provided the supplies for their use. The Wampanoag thought these English were behaving like disrespectful thieves, which they were. Using a small working boat, the English continued to explore the bay, looking for a good place to set up their colony. At one point in their exploration, a storm blew them into Plymouth Harbor. They thought that this place was suitable for their needs and decided to settle there. English explorer John Smith had already named this location New Plymouth after a town in England. Now I will stop and tell you, I'm ashamed to say that John Smith is one of my ancestors. I'm related to him. Which after reading this, I was like, oh, really? Oof. What the colonists found around New Plymouth was not an empty wilderness, though it may have looked so to their English eyes. It was Pawtuxet, which still had tilled fields, home sites, graves, trails, and food stores. On December 25th, the English started building homes at the place they now called Plymouth. The English believed that any unimproved or wild land was the rightful property of Christian Europeans. In a letter to his financial backers in England, Robert Cushman wrote of the native people Their land is spacious and void, and there are few. They are not industrious, neither have art, science, skill, or faculty to use either the land or the commodities of it, but all spoils, rots, and is marred for want of manuring, gathering, ordering, etc. So it is lawful now to take a land which none useth, and make use of it. But the English didn't understand what they were looking at. The land was far from empty and chaotic. It had been inhabited, tilled, and traveled by native people for thousands of years. It just didn't look like Europe. Here's another picture of what they would have looked like. Look at that beautiful face. Those eyes tell a story alone. Wampanoag diplomacy. On March 16th, 1621, the English had a surprise visit from Samoset, a leader of the Abenaki people to the north. He stayed for several days, amazing them because he could speak English. One of the colonists wrote, "He was a man free in speech, so far as he could express his mind, and of a seemingly carriage. He had a bow and 2 arrows, the one headed, the other unheaded." Samoset was there to gather information. His 2 arrows, one blunt and one pointed, most likely carried a message. Will it be peace or war with these strangers? Samoset brought Tixsquantum, often called Squanto, one of the Wampanoag men who had been kidnapped by earlier English explorers. Tixsquantum had returned to his homeland only to find that he was one of the last surviving people from the Pawtuxet village. Tixsquantum agreed to live among the colonists and act as a translator. Another Wampanoag Pnice, or warrior council, named Habamak, also moved his family to the site to keep an eye on the settlement. Here you can see that's what they were looking at. And moved diplomatic meetings held at Plymouth were arranged between Massasoit and the English governor John Carver. They made a formal agreement including rules for contact between the English and the Wampanoag. This peace also included a military alliance should either side be attacked. Both sides needed this alliance. The Wampanoag had lost many people to the plague, and although the English had powerful weapons, there were very few of them. Both sides likely thought that if they joined together, they could keep the Nagaransat and other more powerful neighboring tribes from taking advantage of their vulnerable position. This agreement was made in March of 1621. Shortly after this meeting, Carver died and was succeeded by William Bradford. It is likely that the English harvest of 1621 was the next occasion that the Massasoit traveled to the English town. Making a myth. There was neither cranberry sauce nor pumpkin pie at the 1621 harvest celebration. There were no Indians with woven blankets over their shoulders and large feathered headdresses cascading down their backs. There were no pilgrims in somber black clothes and tall hats with silver buckles either. The English didn't even call themselves pilgrims at the time. That's the myth. The 19th century painters who created these dramatic images were just plain wrong. They got their ideas about Indian dress from Western Plains Indians who performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and from popular historical pageants staged by non-Indians. They wanted to show the religious intensity and bravery of the English, looking prosperous and wearing somber clothing. They often drew the native people to look like ignorant savages, outnumbered by the English and lurking on the sidelines. These images have been reproduced in so many schoolrooms and pageants and illustrations that people think they must be true. At Plymouth Plantation, a living history museum of the 17th century Plymouth, visitors see staff in carefully researched clothing, wearing doublets and waistcoats in shades of red, yellow, blue, or purple. Visitors are often surprised by how colorful English garments were. They are equally surprised to see beautifully decorated Wampanoag clothing, fashioned from deerskin, elk hide, and moose hide, and fur. Through scholarship, authentic craftsmanship, and careful attention to all the museum's historical details, they allow Plymouth Plantation to offer a more accurate picture of the past. The harvest. In December of 1621, colonist Edward Winslow wrote a letter that briefly described the year's harvest. In 1622, this letter was included in a publication describing the beginnings of the New English plantation at Plymouth. Winslow wrote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so that we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help besides, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming among us, and among the rest, in their greatest king, Messuet, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, and bestowed upon our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it is this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." So there's a great map of, that's what Pawtuxet would have looked like. Over time, Winslow's account of the harvest event has become the basis for the myth of that first Thanksgiving. What actually happened during these 3 days that English colonists and Wampanoag people met and ate together? First, let us look at some of the events leading up to it. Tisquantum had been living with the English for almost 6 months, teaching them how to grow corn and fish to fertilize their fields. He and Hobbamock acted as translators and go-betweens for Massasoit. In early summer, William Bradford sent Edward Winslow and Stephen Hopkins to Pockenucket, a Wampanoag village where Massasoit lived. Tisquantum accompanied them. They brought gifts to Massasoit, and as was customary, they also paid him honor by shooting their muskets in salute. One of the gifts Bradford sent was a copper chain. Winslow explained that in the future, any native who came to Plymouth carrying the chain would be greeted and entertained as a special messenger from Massasoit. So here's what they actually would have looked like. On the autumn day Winslow described in his letter, when Governor Bradford sent 4 men to hunt wildfowl, the Wampanoag in the area no doubt heard this shooting. When the Englishmen started marching and firing their muskets in unison, the noise got even louder. It is likely that nearby native people felt that Massasoit should be informed. Perhaps Massasoit wondered if the English were preparing for war. We may never know, but the fact that he showed up with 90 men, and apparently no women, shows he was being cautious. When it became clear to all that the English were celebrating, Massasoit sent some of his men out to hunt deer for meat to contribute to the feast. Once it was seen to be safe, it is likely that native women and children, particularly Hobbamock's family, joined them. For 3 days, the English and native people met and ate together. In English style, Massasoit and his advisors probably ate with the leading men of the colony at a high table which featured the best food. Tables were probably set up both indoors and outdoors for other dinners. Men, women, and children all helped in getting and preparing the food. This work included butchering the deer, grinding corn, plucking birds, gathering shellfish, roasting meat, and preparing whatever else was on hand. Other entertainments took place, which probably included playing ball, competitive sports, singing, music, and perhaps even dancing. The Wampanoag were especially fond of games of chance. If the English and Wampanoag children played together, they probably played games known to both cultures, such as Blind Man's Bluff, where a blindfolded hunter tries to catch another player, or the ring and pin game, where the object is to loop a ring over the pin. The Englishmen took part in exercising of arms, military drills that involved marching and musket shooting. So again, these are some more accurate pictures of what things would have looked like. We're almost done, guys. You're doing great. The land's plenty. Indigenous foodstuffs, food native to the region, made up the bulk of both the Wampanoag and the English diet. While turkey and pumpkin may have been eaten at the traditional harvest celebration, much of what we now think of as traditional Thanksgiving menu was not available in 1621. If wild turkey were served, it was without cranberry sauce. Potatoes were not grown in New England until the 18th century. Sugar was in short supply, so there was probably very few sweets. Nasump, which is what this is a traditional Wampanoag dish which consists of dried corn pounded in a mortar and boiled in plain water to a thick porridge. Usually fruits such as strawberries, raspberries, or blueberries were added. Another variation included clam broth with native herbs, green onions, and wild garlic. The English ate several versions of this dish as well, and they include a recipe for it. So if you want to pause it there, you can always have the recipe. And then stewed pompion. That's what that looks like. Here's the recipe for stewed pompion, which is the ancient New England standing dish. In his 1672 book, New England Rarities Discovered, John Jocelyn describes the ancient New England standing dish. The use of the word ancient suggests that the first English housewives in New England relied on vast kettles of stewed pumpkin to fill up their families through the fall and winter months. The phrase standing dish implies its presence every day, if not at every meal. So that is a pumpkin dish. Giving thanks. There's the men. See the beautiful Indian men. Most likely, the Wampanoag men built shelters to stay in for the 3 days while they visited the English settlement. Other Wampanoag people may have arrived later when they heard about the gathering. The leading men of the Plymouth colony treated Massasoit as visiting royalty, showing that they respected his power and were grateful for his kindness to them. The Wampanoag were perhaps there more for political rather than celebratory reasons, but the concept of a harvest gathering was familiar to them, since long before the arrival of the Europeans, the Wampanoag had celebrated festivals of thanks that took place at particular times of the year, including the Strawberry Thanksgiving and the Green Corn Thanksgiving. At these native festivals, the Creator's gift of food was celebrated with songs, dances, and stories that reminded the people to be generous and grateful. The bounty of the harvest was shared with the community. They also thanked what they called the Corn Mother. Pagan. I love the face of the Indian looking at these strange people with their hands in the air. Food including cod, sea bass, venison, duck, clams, cornmeal, beans, squash, nuts, and dried berries were given away to neighbors to remind the people of their need for and responsibility to one another. For the English harvest was the culmination of the year's hard work in the fields. Bountiful crops were a reason to celebrate. In England, these celebrations might be small suppers for individual families, but often neighbors or whole villages joined together to rejoice. The 1621 gathering in Plymouth was not a religious gathering, but most likely a harvest celebration, much like those the English had known in farming communities back home. The English never once used the word Thanksgiving in association with their 1621 harvest celebration. Thanksgiving was a term well known to the English, though it was not associated with festivals. Special days of Thanksgiving, marked by religious services, were an important part of English life. The Plymouth colonists brought this tradition with them to New England, where it evolved over their years in the colony. The colonists' religious days of Thanksgiving involved morning and afternoon services of worship, rather than feasting was the focus of the early Thanksgivings. Although prayers of thanks were probably offered at the 1621 harvest gathering, the first recorded religious Thanksgiving Day in Plymouth happened in 1623, a full 2 years later. On this occasion, the colonists were giving thanks to God for rain after a 2-month drought. It was not until centuries later that the 1621 harvest gathering would be incorrectly dubbed the first Thanksgiving. Evolution of a holiday. I promise we're almost done. We have like 2 pages. How did a 1621 harvest gathering evolve into a popular holiday? Colonist states and later the government of the United States proclaimed special days of Thanksgiving for particular occasions. Although without Wampanoag corn, there would have been no harvest to celebrate in 1621. In later years, the colonists proclaimed the days of Thanksgiving for military victories over native people. One came after the burning of the Pequot Fort in 1637. Another celebrated the death of Massasoit's son at the end of King Philip's War in 1676. The first nationwide Thanksgiving celebrated victory over the British at the Revolutionary War Battle of Saratoga in 1777. In the 19th century, the modern Thanksgiving holiday began to take shape. In 1841, New England historians rediscovered the passage about the 1621 harvest gathering and incorrectly labeled it the first Thanksgiving. Then in 1846, Sarah Joseph Hale, editor of a magazine called Godey's Lady's Book, began a campaign for an annual national Thanksgiving holiday. In 1863, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln declared 2 national Thanksgivings. One in August commemorated the Battle of Gettysburg. The second, in November, was to give thanks for general blessings. During this time of turmoil, the myth of brave pilgrims inviting native people to sit with them in community and peace was very comforting. The autumn date coincided with New England's seasonal harvests and soon became adopted as a general Thanksgiving Day. A broken peace. For 3 days in 1621,